Thanks again, Ben, for joining us. As all of you know, Ben Nelson is the founder and CEO of Minerva, and I'm very, very excited to be chatting with you today because over the past 5 or 6 years, for some reason, I've been kind of following Minerva from afar. I remember when I was teaching English at a high school in China, we organized an event for our students to learn about Minerva. And one of them actually got accepted. So that was exciting back in 2015. And and I remember meeting Ken Ross, who led Eurasia efforts, and Alex Everett-Cobo in Latin America. I'm originally from Chile. And I always wondered, the one thing I had about Minerva is why you chose Buenos Aires and not Santiago as your South American location.
Very bad food in Santiago, very bad food.
Well, great wine. Well, Argentina has that too, I suppose. Cool. So Ben, the opening question will be fairly introductory. We know that Minerva is trying to change the future of higher education and build the future of higher education. But in case some people here are not super familiar with Minerva, if you could give us a quick introduction, tell us more about the blend of remote learning and in-person international cohorts, your pedagogical approach, etc.
Sure, I'll try to keep it a little brief because Minerva is very, very complex and has got many facets to it. But the easiest way to understand what we're trying to do at Minerva, it approaches it from two different aspects of what we do. The first, which is we think by far the most important, is the educational philosophy. And the easiest way to wrap your head around that is that we all know, because we all went to high schools, universities, that these are actually not educational institutions. That's a little bit of a controversial thing to say because people often think, wait a second, I'm educated. And the easiest way to understand why that may not be the case is assume that you are just presented with any final exam that you took in any class in college right now, this instant, and you had the same allotted amount of time to complete that exam, and then it would be graded. I would bet, and I'm a little bit older than most folks here on the call, but I would bet that even those who are not that far out of school would flunk all of the exams they got A's on in college. And that is because universities certify short-term recall of information. You cram the exam, you pass the exam, you cram for the exam, you pass the exam, then you forget what's on the exam. That is the pattern. That is not an education. An education isn't just remembering, it's actually far more important. It's understanding what it is that is the purpose of that class, and then being able to apply it in dramatically different contexts. In fact, that test of being able to take a piece of learning you've done in one class and apply it in another, for example, study physics and then be given a biology exam without any background in or any questions about the biological content, but just how to apply the physics concepts in biology, would yield to an almost universal failure among the greatest students at the greatest universities. That's the problem psychologists refer to as far transfer. And that is actually the point of education. It's not to certify short-term recall, it is to create long-term, lasting, and transferable learning. And the Minerva educational revolution is to shift the educational enterprise from the short-term siloed recall-oriented certification to a long-term application of wisdom, which is applying what you learn in a new context. So that's kind of aspect number one of what we do. Aspect number two of what we do is how our theory of change works on a scaled environment. And that is also a little bit aberrant, not particularly common to others, which is that in the world of education, there is a tried and true way to generate reform or change of any kind, whether it's for the positive or the negative. And that is through changing of elite institutions. When an elite higher education institution does anything, pretty much every other institution in the world follows blindly, whether it's a good or a bad thing. And there are many examples of this throughout the 19th century, and the 20th century, and the 21st century. And our theory of change is, well, if we actually created our own elite institution, our own institution that would actually fly above Oxbridge, above the Ivy League, and create an example for other institutions to follow, all of a sudden there would be a model that's sustainable and effective that they could do so. And so Minerva both has the substantive view of what education should be, and then the construct by which other institutions can follow. And that combination is the kind of the essence of what we do.
Yeah, I find that very exciting, the focus on the smart transfer, on what and the active learning that really requires. Can you tell us a little bit more about the learning platform on one end and the international experience that enables?
Sure. Sure. And sorry, Diego, there's a little bit of background echo with you, so you may want to jigger your wires. But sure. So the way in which, it's lovely to say, oh, we teach people to be wise and everybody else teaches things that people don't retain and therefore it's better. But one may ask, well, how do you do that? And so the key insight into that is that in order to teach transferable practical knowledge that you can apply in different ways, you have to not only teach that conceptual idea or ideas that you want people to transfer, but then you have to deliberately, across a curricular journey, apply or help students apply that learning in context after context, setting after setting. So it turns out when you have a core intellectual taxonomy that is pervasive across any course journey that a student may opt to take, you actually have to have an extraordinarily well-structured curriculum that has these learning objectives scaffolded throughout it. You have to ensure that the students are actively engaged in applying what they learn so that they can actually retain that in long-term memory, and that they have to have significant, systematic, formative feedback that goes along that journey. In other words, you kind of have to have a data-rich environment in which you learn. And guess what is not a data-rich environment? A professor sitting around a table with 12 students hearing the professor pontificate. That is a data-poor environment. Unfortunately, that modality of a person professing what they know to others is in the name, whether it's professor, lecturer, etc., of the sector. And therefore, you actually, what we realized is we actually need to create our own digital learning environment where we can ensure that students, that professors are deeply engaged, where that scaffolded cross-contextual curriculum is pervasive no matter what it is they do, and they have a data-rich environment in which they learn. Now, at the same time, we very much believe in lived experiential learning, actually being able to be in a social community where you interact with others, etc. And so all of our students actually wind up living in the same building. It's not we don't even spread them across the campus. They're very concentrated, but that building full of students, not the building itself, but the students within it, travel over their 4 years. They live in 7 different countries, living in a different building in each one of those locations, and applying what they learn in different cultural contexts as well. And so for years before the pandemic, we were the only university in the world where all of our students, again, lived in the same infrastructure, the same building, yet they were never allowed to congregate in a physical classroom for education because the digital learning environment we built was vastly superior to what can be done offline. And that's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance because most people think of online learning, especially over the past couple of years, as vastly inferior to what you could do offline. And that is because when you take a fundamentally broken approach that happened to be done comfortably in an offline way, even as ineffective as it is, and just say, oh, just slap technology onto it, that's not going to fix the problem. You actually have to rethink the educational enterprise and build a technology environment that enables that kind of education. And so that's the nature of what we do. So it's a residential university, global in its nature, students from all over the world, traveling all over the world, but doing their formal education via a digital learning environment, which is in some ways like this, live video, multi-threaded, but built for educational purposes.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think it really takes the best of that residential experience with using technology to really boost learning in pedagogically kind of very, very sound ways. One thing I'm wondering when I hear you describe the far transfer of knowledge, learning not for memorizing content, but for discussion, for learning how to learn in these small, less than 20-person classes. If you take away the international aspect and the online learning platform, it does sound a lot. It does sound very similar to when you hear proponents of smaller liberal arts colleges defend their institutions. You know, we don't do graduate level research, but we focus on the education. We have small seminar classes around a round table, and that is the reason why U.S. higher education draws so many students around the world. In my country, as in most countries, higher ed is much more content heavy and much more pre-professional. So how do you think Minerva differs from that from that alternative, the seminar-based liberal arts college? And what can it offer them that liberal arts college cannot?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what the marketing is behind those liberal arts colleges. Unfortunately, much like all higher education marketing, it's an absolute lie. There's no connection of that to reality. And the easy way to think about it is think about what the course of study is. Pick any liberal arts college you'd like in the country, pick any research university in the country, and find out what is the course of study that is different in that liberal arts college versus I went to the University of Pennsylvania, 10,000 undergraduate students, right? So what is the difference between being a physics major at Penn versus being a physics major at Swarthmore? Anybody have any idea? There is no difference, zero. Same physics 101, same physics 102, same textbook, same classes, same lecture, same lab. It's exactly the same. The only difference is Swarthmore is smaller. So in your Physics 101 lecture, rather than having 12 sections of 200 students each of Physics 101, Swarthmore has 2 sections of 70 students each. Okay, right. So what, right? How does that really help? Right. And guess what? At Penn, 10,000 person undergraduate institution, you still have an English writing seminar where, I remember my 20-person English writing seminar was writing about films about the French Revolution. That was the name of the seminar. It was lovely, right? I had a very funny professor. He made fun of our terrible writing, and we watched movies every other class that we had to write our writing practices on, like high school. But that's not that different than Swarthmore either. So when you actually come down to it, right, it's really all in the marketing. It would be one thing if Swarthmore were to say, no, we really care about education. We have a core curriculum. You actually have to learn kind of the habits of mind, like University of Chicago did in the 30s and 40s. Swarthmore doesn't do that. It doesn't have a core curriculum. It has distribution requirements, just like the University of Pennsylvania does, right? You've got to take 2 classes in science and 2 classes in history and 2 classes in the humanities and 2 classes in the social sciences. But they're from this big distribution. What are the classes you take? Lectures, Psych 101, Sociology 101, etc. So when it really comes down to it, right, what is actually the difference? Yeah, they're smaller. They have fewer major options. Maybe the classes themselves, you can more quickly get into a small number of students per class. But I took a whole bunch of small classes at Penn. The vast majority of them were lectures. I took a 12-person lecture class on Dostoevsky. Not a single student said a thing in the entire class. The teacher also happened to be like a good Russian scholar, a professional drunk. And he was so boring and so lit when he was delivering his lecture to the 12 of us that during one lecture, he actually fell asleep while delivering the lecture, slumped over in his chair. He fell asleep in mid-sentence. And 15 minutes later, he woke up and completed the sentence, just to give you a sense of what a professional drunk this man was. He knew exactly what he was doing. I took another class taught by the great Chaim Potok, great author, again, 18, 19 person class. But the problem was that there was a very, very attractive girl in the class for whom Chaim Potok decided that he would demonstrate to the rest of us how he gives her a tutorial for the entire semester. Didn't ask us any questions at all, but interrogated the heck out of her. And for us, it was a lecture bandied about between the two of them. And so these were examples of the types of things you would find at a quote unquote liberal arts college, but they're still disconnected. They still have no curricular coherence whatsoever. They may have a few and small number of students, but you have no idea what the professor does, and their instincts are to lecture. So right. The marketing is great, but the reality is quite different.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder if it's to some degree kind of their legacy structures. I'm also wondering if my voice sounds better now. I think it was a little bit echoey earlier.
It's off and on. It's okay, you still get a little bit of the bathtub.
At least it seems you can get the meaning of what I'm saying.
Now
shifting gears a little bit, we have obviously a lot of founders and prospective founders at South Park Commons, and you yourself have founded a company and institution and organization that's now over 10 years old. And I noticed that you have Minerva University and Minerva Project. You also have the new high school offering now, Minerva Baccalaureate. But juggling these two, which is something I hadn't really seen before, like having a for-profit arm, the Minerva Project, and the nonprofit university. As a founder, how do you deal with those two different missions? Do they ever clash? How do they benefit each other?
Yeah, great question. So so we have the university, which is a nonprofit, and we have the corporation, which built all the intellectual property, which is a regular Silicon Valley startup, if you could call it what we do regular, but operates in that way. And the split is relatively straightforward. The university is a charity. It overwhelmingly focuses, despite the fact that it is the most selective university in the world, it's also the most socioeconomically diverse selective university in the world. And so to give you some kind of basis of comparison, the Minerva, that again, not only is most selective, it has vastly better outcomes for its students. And I saw there's a question about like what subjects we're particularly good at. It's the subjects of the mind. So, I wouldn't enroll at Minerva University to learn how to be a better sculptor or a better dentist. You kind of have to, sculpt, work with clay and drill teeth. But if you're doing something that is developing the mind, the Minerva methodology is vastly better, and the outcomes are vastly better than any other university, liberal arts college, Ivy League university, et cetera, when you look at what our students do after graduation. But if you look at the inputs that we have, a typical highly selective university, basically any Ivy League university, the modal student is a millionaire. Not well-to-do, not rich. I mean, the modal student coming into the Ivy League is a millionaire. 100% of selective universities in the United States draw more students from the top 5% of the socioeconomic spectrum than the bottom 50. Practically every university, I think with an exception of some of the state schools that are highly ranked, but certainly every private university has more students from the top 2% than the bottom 60, right? So that's to give you some perspective. The modal student at Minerva comes from a household making less than $25,000 a year. 60% of our students come from households making less than $50,000 a year. And so to have better than Stanford or Harvard level outcomes with a student population that doesn't have their job upon entry into the university is a dramatic level of impact. And because those students can't possibly afford our already low tuition rates, you have to raise a lot of money for philanthropy, right? There's no market for scholarships. And so that's fundamentally a nonprofit organization with a nonprofit mission. And there is no profit. In fact, the corporation is a net donor and will always be a net donor to the university. It actually helps in its, both in establishing it, basically paid to the established institution, but also in the long run. Now, the corporation in and of itself has built, and one of the reasons it created the university is in order to develop the intellectual property that it consists of that technology, the curricular approach, the learning methodologies, the feedback system, and the Minerva brand, which is an extraordinarily rare asset. It's in fact the only privately held elite higher education brand in history. There's never been a corporation that is not a nonprofit that owns an elite higher education brand. And that creates a very unique set of assets. And now, as university has gone through its incubation from another university, it's been set up as a standalone nonprofit. It was incubated before, in another nonprofit before, and has gotten its full accreditation in July. Now, Minerva Project, the corporation, is actually beginning to commercialize its intellectual property. And in fact, of course, we had no idea a pandemic was coming, but the fact that we were the only pre-pandemic residential university to use technology as the main modality of our education, all of a sudden, in the post-pandemic world, made people look at us and say, what? I mean, we were forced into this hellhole. You chose to live in this world, and all of a sudden it enabled the rest of the higher education sector to understand, and now indeed the secondary education sector, to understand that, wait a second, if you actually rethink the educational enterprise, you can leverage technology to educate in vastly better ways. And that's the crux of the goal behind the corporation. And so we engage with high schools, with universities, we help them design or rethink the way that they educate their students, and build programs for them, train their teachers and professors on how to deliver those programs, and then help them deliver them on the intellectual property that we've developed.
Do you find that adoption has sped up during COVID of other institutions, other universities using the Minerva platform?
Dramatically. I mean, the reality is that before COVID, we weren't even commercializing. We were experimenting with seeing how this works one way or another. And our goal was actually to begin the commercialization process in the summer of 2020. And, and of course, COVID hit. Initially, it was actually not a particularly easy conversation, because in the early days of COVID, there were people were just looking for a technology fix, right? They weren't looking to say, oh, let's rethink our entire educational enterprise. They said, oh my God, we've got to deliver our terrible lectures online, and Zoom has this filter that makes our lectures boring, and we got to find some technology that doesn't have that filter. And of course, Zoom has no such filter. The lectures were just awful. And so, but nobody was really in the headspace to engage on those conversations. Starting a little over a year ago, in the fall of last year, a year and a half ago, universities started to be able to kind of pick their head up and say, wait a second, we can still do the lack of education online just like we do it offline, but the world is a little bit exposed to the problem of what we do. We need to rethink this, and who can we rethink it with? Oh, Minerva knows how to do this. And so we've dramatically accelerated really from a very start over the last, I mean, I think we will, we already have, but we certainly will this quarter, right? This January, February, March have done more booked contract value than we have since inception. And we see, a lot of that trend continuing.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you know, when you say that, it reminds me of how ill-suited some of the platforms that we were using were for online learning. Like in Google Classroom, you couldn't see yourself when you were presenting. So imagine if you were teaching with your back to the class. It just didn't make any educational sense. But yeah, have you ever found, because you mentioned that you're the only elite institution and university to be owned by a
the brand,
corporation.
not
A
the
brand,
university.
right.
The university
Okay.
is a nonprofit, but the brand is owned by the
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. And yeah, how do you split your time and your decision making in that sense? Because and I imagine it's very different kinds of decisions. One is more kind of education can be aligned to profits, but one is more commercial than the other. How do you split your brain up? How does that work?
The reality now is, I mean, when we were incubated within our host university, the corporation didn't do anything but run the university as part of the host institution. So 100% of my time was devoted to the university, and practically none of it was devoted to the corporation. Once we spun out into an independent nonprofit from our host university, we set up a separate management infrastructure, a different board. I'm a member of the board. I have an honorary title of being the chancellor of the university, which is, they kind of wheel me out of my coffin to, address the students in ceremonial parts, and then wheel me back in and bury me in the process. But I don't actually run the institution. I don't run the nonprofit. So, I didn't have to do that much code switching one way to another. But as we were setting up the entire enterprise, it was very, very clear what goes where, in the sense that anything that develops intellectual property, anything that can be leveraged by other institutions, that is done under the auspices of the corporation. The corporation it owns that intellectual property, and anything that is necessary to operate that isn't really connected to broader intellectual property, that is owned by the university, or done by the university, I should say. And that's why the university licenses it for free, but it licenses the intellectual property from the corporation. It gets the ability to use the brand, the technology, the curriculum. All that was paid for and built by the corporation, but the university that we set up gets access to it for free.
Got it. Huh. I'm going to go actually to one of the, I've been meaning to ask, in this model that you've been describing, and I really like how you described the difference between the small liberal arts college and the Minerva experience. But are there any things that you miss from a traditional university that you plan to integrate, to adapt in some shape or form?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a number of things that the universities provide their students that we don't by choice. And there are other things that are offered that we supplement for our students in other ways. So for example, we don't offer our students by choice any of the infrastructure of a campus. No cafeterias, no gyms, no university gyms, no university sports programs, no university performing arts centers, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that our students don't eat and don't exercise and don't do sports and don't do arts. It's just that we do it the way we all do it, because we're adults, right? And it turns out we don't need cafeterias and, employer provided gyms and our own performing arts centers. And I mean, this is kind of fantasy land. It's also because these institutions are built, guess for who? A bunch of rich, spoiled brats. They're not actually built for regular humans. They're built for people who need that absurd infrastructure because, the servants have been giving them food since they were born. And that is the mentality of these institutions. I mean, it is kind of a shocking exemplar of privilege. We think by choice that is pretty damn destructive, that actually getting students to live as residents of a city with some supervision to make sure that they know how to adopt to that is a vastly better education than literally spoon feeding students a fantasy curated life. Forget for after they graduate, I'm just thinking about for the summer, right? I mean, imagine, you know, the student is like actually getting their first internship, and that's a huge problem, right? That is generated by those modalities. And it's really important to understand that universities don't think of their clientele as their students, right? They're not designed for their entire student body. They're designed for the people who pay the bills, right? The people who pay the bills. Actually, when I was starting Minerva, I had this kind of curious phenomenon at universities, right? Because if you look at the graduate programs of these institutions, like PhD programs, 50% of the students are not American, right? They come from all over the world. They're the best and brightest. You know, you look at the undergraduate program, it's like 10% among the elite institutions.
Right.
You know, among some institutions, it's 3 or 4%. And I was just scratching my head. I said, I don't get it. Why would the same institution be so much more diverse from a graduate program perspective compared to an undergraduate program perspective? It didn't make sense. And I was asking one of my advisors, who used to be the dean at the Wharton School. He said, Ben, didn't you learn anything at Wharton? It's all lifetime value, right? The reality is that universities, they don't care about the tuition dollars. I mean, yes, it's important. What they really care about is donations, right? And so they cater, everything they do is for the people who have a lifetime value of the university of $100 million, right? As individuals. That's who the university is built for. It's not built for anybody else. Everybody else is there for the benefit of those people. And it was kind of a fascinating approach to understand. It says graduate students don't donate to their alma mater. It's the undergraduates that do, right? And usually undergraduates that come from wealth and privilege, you know, have a tradition of donations, and they actually continue that tradition. So universities kind of know where the bread is buttered, and that's what they're focused on. And it was really a kind of a stark reminder as to how these institutions are structured.
Wow. Yeah, that I always wondered about that disparity as an undergrad international student, actually. And it is very, very sharp. And thinking again about those differences, and now I'm actually going to turn to because it's very much related to this part of the conversation. Cameron had a question about graduate level research. If you want to go ahead and ask that, Cameron.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, you know, when I think back to undergrad, like, I guess, as you say, right, like I would probably fail a number of my final exams, but one of my main takeaways was, you know, time I was able to spend doing research with you know, professors and research groups. And I'm curious, you know, kind of maybe putting aside, you know, whether that's the right way or the wrong way, like if or if you want to talk about that, that's fine too.
Yeah.
But like the thing I'm interested in mainly is, right, like, let's say like this catches on, like more people start doing this, I don't want to say remote, but hybrid kind of style, you know, education. Like, how does academia change, and how does that whole kind of get plugged? Because I do think that, like, for better or worse, that's an important part of the journey of like training academics as well, right? Is like that kind of early experience to research.
That's exactly right. And in fact, it's one of those things which is the people often get confused between research experience, like what you're talking about, and lab classes, right? Because lab classes, as I would imagine you're experienced, are usually kind of worthless. But actually going in the lab and doing research is really useful, right? And so one of the things that we do, I mentioned like those things, infrastructure that we by choice don't do and don't want to replicate. But then there are other things like research labs that we don't have, but that we make sure that our students get access to, right? So we're big believers in students, especially in natural sciences, doing independent research in labs over the summer, where it could be in biotech, it could be in research labs at research institutions, et cetera. And so we've had students do research at Princeton, at Caltech, at some of our partner institutions all over the world, and Lawrence Livermore labs at the Santa Fe Institute, right? So these are all examples of places where our students get access to that. But what we're not believers in at all are lab classes, right? Where you're taking your Bio 101 and then you have your Bio 101 lab, and then you go into the lab and you say, oh, now, you know, you do this and that, and you should be seeing the frog thing here and the embryo there. And it's very formulaic. And frankly, that ability is not a particularly educational perspective. I have an acquaintance who was a Nobel Prize winner at Caltech. Her name is Frances Arnold. And she recounted to me a story where she says she picks students for her lab from the classes that she teaches, her advanced classes. And so on the first day of the lab, she gets her 12 undergraduates that she picks for her lab into the room. He says, okay, how many of you remember what I taught you last semester in class? And of course, everybody raises their hand, even though they're all lying. And she says, okay, forget all of that. Now I'm going to teach you how to do science. Because unfortunately, so much of the work that she does in a class environment where there's an instruction, you do something, you follow something, is in many ways antithetical to the scientific process. My parents happen to be lab scientists. I grew up in their lab, and I found the work to be massively boring. But it's not a, it's shocking as to how much of what they do is applied intuition, right? Where the formal study is about actually understanding principles of physics and chemistry, despite the fact they're doing now structural biology, but for a long time, molecular biology. It's really all thinking about those theoretical principles and getting that practice of lab research where they have a hypothesis and they'll spend 2 years on that hypothesis, figuring out, will this work, will that work, and creating intuitions and applying intuitions based on their formal education or their formal learning, I should say, on how to apply it in lab. So we're big believers in lab research experience. We're very big critics of lab classes.
Interesting. In a way, it's almost like a decoupling of that of research and education, but that still gives students that access to those valuable research experiences and independent labs, think tanks.
It's the same thing as internships, right? I mean, for many students, research is of no use whatsoever, at least lab research, but you know, working at a company is useful, or working at a nonprofit, or working on legislation, or what have you. The ability to apply what you've learned in an academic setting in a real application that doesn't have the kind of structure as a learning environment per se does, it's invaluable. You've got to be able to tool your educational program to connect with those things.
Switching to a very different topic, actually. A lot of us here at South Park Commons. Oh, and actually, I wanted to actually note that we've already had Minerva alumni who have joined South Park Commons. So that already shows you how awesome they are. So that's very, very cool. You really see that success there. And at South Park Commons, there's a lot of people who are interested in Web3, in crypto and DAOs, etc. And all over the Web3 space, you're starting to see educational institutions that claim to create a university for the 21st century. You have Invisible College Direct, XYZ, LearnDAO, Proof of Learn now raised $15 million to create a platform for decentralized learning. Do any of those ideas resonate? Have you looked into them a lot at all? Do you see Minerva adopting any Web3 elements in the future, or is that something that's just totally outside of your model?
Yeah, for me, take Web3 and look at it the same way as ed tech broadly, right? What does the vast majority of ed tech do? It says, here's a technology, now let's apply it to education, right? Or here's a feature, let's make an organization out of it. Or hey, let's go and do something in education. We don't know what it is, and let's iterate our way to a result. None of that works. It just doesn't, right? You can have more meaningless certifications. You can say, oh, I'll teach you to cram for this exam, or I'll do it else, but in some other more efficient way. But you're not actually going to wind up educating somebody, right? In order to actually have an education technology, you have to first have an educational philosophy. You actually have to understand, what is it that is missing in a current system, or what can a current system not do, or what is something that a current system does poorly. But what's the science behind the way that the brain functions and works that you need to address? And as you figure out, oh, well, I need space deliberate practice, and I need to actually track that space deliberate practice, and I really want to have different types of high iterative reliability graders give feedback, and I want some veracity behind that, and an audit trail of who gave the results. And then I want to make sure to connect those audit trails to different ways. And that's interesting. Boy, that's a very complex thing. But oh, wait a second, maybe the blockchain can actually help us do that. Okay, that can be a plausible approach. I've never heard that kind of pitch, right? I've heard the pitch of crypto, blockchain, NFT, make money, get rich, be an idiot. What can I do? Oh, education, big business, let's apply it over there. It's all bullshit. But really all of ed tech is like that in one way or another, right? So that's the reality. And the problem is you gotta, education is not, it's not bullshit. It's serious stuff. I mean, imagine you were thinking about it as brain surgery, right? Would you be like, oh, I'm going to apply crypto to brain surgery? We'll be like, fuck you. I'm not going to let you touch my brain with your NFT. I mean, have you lost your freaking mind? Well, education is brain surgery, right? That is what's at stake, right? You wouldn't let people do knee surgery on you with some random technology that has nothing to do with it, right? You have to actually have a philosophy and a hypothesis, a plausible hypothesis of what's wrong and what you need to fix. Then you figure out the technology piece.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I relate to that frustration with ed tech a lot. There's very much a lot of settings where it does feel kind of more tech driven than education driven. I'm going to shift a little bit towards the audience questions, just so we have time to get those in. So if anybody else has questions they want to ask, you can share them on the chat. So Shahab was asking, if you want to go ahead, Shahab, about the attracting students.
Yeah, hey, Ben. And we've talked about Minerva in the past, but I think this is one thing we didn't talk about, which is what do you think attracted the initial cohort of students to Minerva? How did you go about making it known? And what do you think, what was the particular value that they saw? And how has the kind of marketing evolved over time, I imagine, as the brand became more known?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I wish a lot of people had asked me this, and nobody likes my answer because it's not a comforting answer. We raised a crazy amount of money and we spent it. So we spent $100,000 per enrolled student in our pilot class. Right? Think about a customer acquisition cost, that order of magnitude. It was a crazy amount of money. And we did that after getting an avalanche of free press when we came out initially. So we were really, really lucky that we had a message that resonated when we first launched. We got something like 15 billion media impressions in our first 3 years for free. Right. And so, and then on top of that, we had all of the spend and having talent scouts effectively all over the world and using social media, and once we identified the students, flew them into San Francisco for the Cell weekend, what we refer to as Ascend, et cetera. So we pulled out all the stops to make that first class happen. And then, of course, as the years went on and the brand became much stronger, we dropped that cost of acquisition by a couple of orders of magnitude. But it was a lot of money to get off the ground. And I wish there was a clever way of doing it. I'm sure there are other ones. We weren't smart enough to figure that out. But for us, it was expensive.
And thinking of scaling, so that's the very beginning. I guess that early customer acquisition. Omar was asking about the longer term perspective for scaling. I think that ties in.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Omar.
Well, for us, that really is the Minerva Project. It is the global reformation of education, and we use that term reformation in an intentional way. We don't believe in a homogeneity of education. We don't believe that an institution should educate vast populations. Right now, there are very large institutions that certify vast populations. Luckily or unluckily, they don't do any education in that process, but that's a separate problem, right? But the University of Phoenixes of the world, the Arizona State Universities or the Southern New Hampshires, right? They put a lot of stamps on people's foreheads, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, doesn't really matter. But there's scant evidence that students actually learn. And by the way, there's scant evidence students actually learn at Harvard or Stanford either. So that's not it's not necessarily a damnation. It's just that they at least keep their damage to a small set of humans as opposed to an increasingly larger and larger set of humans. And so our hope is that the Minerva movement is actually going to help reform institutions to center on education. And whether they work with Minerva Project or not in that process, even when they work with us, every single one of our institutional partners has different educational programming that they have on offer, which is different than the educational programming on offer at Minerva University. And so we're not advocating that, hundreds of thousands of students go to a crazy 7-country rotation with the kind of insane levels of academic demands that we put on our students and everything that is involved in that process. We think that is the world's best education for a very specific sliver of humanity. And our goal is to find those great individuals and provide them this amazing opportunity. But there are other amazing humans and all sorts of other walks of life and interests and proclivities, and they should have their own incredible education that's tailored more to their needs and wants. And our goal is to create an ecosystem of effective educational institutions, all of which are focused on wisdom, but all of which are approaching it in a variety of perspectives.
So you have almost two avenues to scale your impact: the indirect kind of prestige of Minerva University and the direct partnerships of Minerva Project, which seem to be it's not clearly not just selling the platform, but it also involves content, curriculum, etc.
Right. I mean, we wrote a 400-page book. We open sourced everything we did in many ways, right? We wrote a 400-page book on how anybody in this room can build their own Minerva. It's all in there. The curricular approach, the pedagogical approach, the operations, the technology, the whole thing is in there. We've had 6,000 crazy people that actually bought this book, and it is not light reading. It is dense, technical, wonky approach. We've been at this for a decade. There's no second Minerva, right? No one has actually gone out and built it.
Pull it off.
So we'd love for people to go out and do it, but it requires an enormous investment.
And thinking of that investment and how it can be continuous, I remember you were talking about barriers. I know accreditation was a barrier. I used to work in government. I know how tough those kind of things can be. And Lane was wondering about kind of responding quickly. So Lane, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. Responding quickly to change.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hey Ben. So I've seen this both as a student as well as now someone in industry who's hiring. I'm a software developer. I work in tech, so I tend to be, recruiting tech candidates. It's very often the case that they have a good, strong fundamental education in software development, in computer science, things like that, but using technologies and tools that are quite outdated, roughly 10 years behind the curve, so to speak. And I think actually, you touched upon Web3 earlier. This is a great example, right? I think it's almost regardless of your feelings of the relevance of Web3 and the applicability of it, and I share a lot of your concerns, I think it's something that students should be getting exposed to, and by and large, they're not as part of at least undergraduate curriculums at this point. So anyway, I'm just wondering your thoughts with respect to like responsiveness of curriculum to industry demand, and if you have feedback loops with employers or what works or doesn't work for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the crucial things to do is to actually be clear as to what institutions are capable of versus what they're not capable of. And look, and the reality is that universities aren't built for instant feedback loops in their classes. You just can't, right? You just think about it. I remember when in a previous life before Minerva, we were I was in the photo industry, and we had these two kind of competing philosophies on the future of user interface on the internet, right? One was everything was going to be on Flex. Anybody hear Flex? No? Great. Okay. Yeah. One person. And then the others was like, it's all going to be Ajax. It's all Ajax. Anybody like working with Ajax today? Like, no. Right. But at the time, that was like the hot thing. There was a Flex Camp, which was basically an adaptation of Adobe Flash that was more interactive and all the rest. And there was Ajax. Oh my God, Ajax is the best thing in the world. And both of these things, 3 years after they were like all the rage, were completely and utterly dead, right? So now, and 3 years before they were all the rage, didn't exist, right? So imagine a really forward-thinking university that circa 2007 was told the future is Ajax or Flex. And they're like, oh my God, the future is Ajax or Flex. We got to incorporate Ajax or Flex into our curriculum, right? They then go and they spend 2.5 years, maybe if they're super fast, 1.5 years, to go and create their Ajax and Flex programs. And then they would go and recruit students into their Ajax and Flex programs. That takes another year. And then they'd spend 4 years training them in their Ajax or Flex program. And then they graduate them, by which point Ajax and Flex were extinct, right? And so it actually doesn't even make sense for a university to offer any of that stuff. It's useless. What's important is for a university to create infrastructure to say, here's how you think about programming. Go out and learn your languages on your own. Go out and apply them in such a way which is relevant and current, which is, I think, one of the reasons why one of the first crypto companies that came out of Minerva came out 6 years ago, right? Because we didn't have a crypto curriculum, right? But it was that kind of pushing the students out into the real world all the time as a matter of practice prevents us from being the barrier in interpreting what the real world contexts are like. And then teaching transferable skills means that when students encounter new context, they can actually apply it well. It's one of the reasons why the students that we graduate that go into engineering do so well, because they have that flexibility of thinking.
We have about 3 minutes left till time. And I was thinking that Ryan Orban's question was a good closer. If you can go ahead, Ryan.
Hey, Ben, a huge fan. I was actually one of the founders of the first data science boot camps in the US. So I've been following Minerva for many years. Great to finally meet you. I would say my question is, for those of us who are well beyond their university years, is there anything that you've learned at Minerva, a system, a process that maybe we could take with us at the end of this call for those of us that are in SBC who are kind of in a similar type of self-discovery and self-education and innovation?
Well, I mean, I wish there were shortcuts, which unfortunately there is space deliberate practice, and cross-contextual learning is important. But what maybe I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse as to how I think the most profound lessons at Minerva occur, which is the things that are hardest to transfer are the things I think which are the most profound to transfer. And I'll give you an example. I saw that Kala or Kayla, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asked a similar question about teaching methodology, but I'll give you an example. Maybe this is an interesting takeaway. One of the things that we teach our students is we refer to as audience. It's one of the 80 learning objectives that we teach our first year students. And audience is very simply know who you're talking to and therefore tailor your message, so it lands with them. Okay, that's a relatively straightforward approach. I think most people that talk in public or even have interpersonal interactions agree that it's not easy. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do, right? It's not always easy to tailor what you say compared to the people around you. But even when you describe it, you say, God, how do you transfer that? Yeah, I mean, I guess you can say, I can talk, I can give a speech, I can write a memo or an email, I can, write an article for a publication, but really that's not far transfer. That's just, small modality shifts. So where do we actually think about audience in contexts that are not just, I am here trying to convince you? And so you then kind of take a step back and say, well, why is it important? Why is it important for me to be effective in the delivery of my message? Well, that's actually because you want to be effective. You want to be effective as a person. You have a point, you want to get it across. And sometimes you have to think about, well, what is the way to get messages across? Sometimes you feel like you need to convince somebody of something directly, and you hammer them with that idea. But if you actually think about audience in a transferred way, think about one of my favorite example of audience is the peacock. Anybody know why the peacock's feathers are so brilliant and so eye-catching? Do you think the peahen that looks at that tail says, oh my God, the aesthetic quality of those feathers are exceptional, and they belong in a peahen museum. And my God, the genetic curation of it is extraordinary. The peahen's brain is this big. She's by all intents and purposes completely non-sentient. So why is it that these astonishing colors exist on the peacock? Why does that attract the mate? I'll assume nobody knows. The reason is that those same brilliant feathers, those things that refract the light, etc., attract the wolf. They attract the hunter. It's what's known as a counter-evolutionary trait. The more the brilliant the feathers, the less likely the peacock is to survive. Now, why would there evolve a trait that would make the peacock less fit? It's because their audience isn't the wolf, it's the peahen. And it shows her, look at the disadvantage that I am carrying, you should mate with me. I've got to be super strong to outrun the fox, to outrun the wolf, because otherwise they would have eaten me, and not that other one that had even less of a burden, both brilliant and weight. Now you say, wait a second, if you actually understand that that is an application of audience, it can actually get you to start rethinking how you communicate with people. Sometimes it's not just about convincing them, it's actually about displaying vulnerability, which really signals strength, right? That's not just something out of some lovey-dovey guru, that is hardcore natural selection biology. And I'll give you another, I think, far more important perspective on how you transfer audience, right? In our world, you really get two sides of the conversation on speech, right? One side says, you know, I can say whatever the hell I want, and I don't give a rat's ass how people think or how they react to what I say. The other side says, I don't really care what anybody intends to say. The only thing that matters is how I feel, right? And everybody needs to think about how I feel, and what I feel is the truth. What does that do for a society? Destroys it. It completely tears it apart. Now, what happens when you internalize the idea of audience? If you want to be an effective communicator, if you want to be effective in crafting your message, you must realize that your intent is completely and utterly irrelevant. The only thing that matters is how a person feels once they hear your message. But you also have to realize that if you want to be an effective collaborator and you're working with anybody else, what you feel, all of your cognitive biases, all of your emotions are also completely irrelevant. And the only thing that matters when you hear a message is what somebody else intends. That's the exact opposite of the conversation in society. Right? And if you actually teach people to approach audience in that way, be hypersensitive because you want to be effective when you communicate to others, and have zero sensitivity when you listen and really interrogate and active listening what it is that the person is trying to say, we would have practically no conflicts in the world.
Amazing. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Wow. Well, somebody, Dan was commenting, did this talk just switch from talking about Minerva to getting a Minerva style lesson?
Except this is not a Minerva style lesson because I spoon fed all of you this,
Right.
right?
We
The way
would
you would normally do it is this would
Forced to think
occur
on our
over a
feet.
couple of weeks or a couple of months. You would come to all these conclusions yourselves. You would actually be able to retain this. Now, a week from now, you're going to be telling somebody, oh, I heard something about, I don't know, speaking to other people, but I can't really articulate it. So I did a terrible job. So
we still appreciated it. Yeah, we don't want to take up more time than we said we would, but this has been very, very illuminating about Minerva. Thinking a lot of gears turning about education and how it can work better, etc. And yeah, we wish you the best of luck as you continue with Minerva. It's an amazing
pleasure,
project.
and best of luck with all of your pursuits and endeavors. I hope you do great things.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.